Welcome back to our series on the parables of Jesus in their historical context. I'm Samantha Corcoran, and in today's video, we'll tackle the parable, or not parable, of the Rich Man and Lazarus. I don't know about you, but growing up, I heard multiple views on, is this a parable? Is this not a parable? And evidence on both sides. What I've done for this video is really dig into the evidence to see which is it. Well, I'm pleased to say, and the reason we're including it in our parable study is most scholars think this is a parable and not about a real person in a real place. Now, it might have been inspired by a real person in a real place in a story, but aren't all parables? I mean, they have everyday objects or people doing everyday things, and this is no different. What is different, and what I think might be causing some confusion, is that this is the only parable that names a character. There are actually two characters in this case, if you count Lazarus and Abraham. So that could be leading to some of the confusion about whether or not this is really a parable. But we do have quite a few bits of evidence in favor of this being a parable. It's more of a vignette, right? I mean, it's giving us a picture to think about that allows Jesus to give a challenge to us. And so we've, as Christians today, have really turned this into allegory, and a lot of people think, well, this is a real story. This is actually depicting what it's going to be like when Jesus comes back and what it's going to be like with heaven and hell. But again, if we're a first century listener, what would we have taken away from this? And there's multiple pieces of evidence that I want to point to, namely that Luke includes this in his parables section in the travel narrative. And so the one piece is of where he included it. Another reason is because it uses the exact same phrase to start the parable as several other parables do. So we've got similarity there. And some scholars have noted that this story stands chiastically against the parable of the rich fool. So they mirror each other. Very interesting in-depth study. I've got an article below if you want to go down a fun rabbit hole with that one. So for the purpose of this video study, we're considering this a parable. Let's begin in Luke chapter 16, verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate, and I am intentionally stopping here because I want this to set the scene. Let's dissect this piece by piece, starting with the purple. Now, this is on display at the museum in Vienna, but it shows where the color purple originates. You guys, it's from snails. It's from snails. And somebody had to go in the water and pick up each snail. Somebody had to harvest these snails. Now, let me tell you about how they actually made the dye. This is fascinating. Now, each snail only produced a few drops of this precious secretion, and so huge quantities were needed for commercial purposes, right? And by some accounts, it took 250,000 snails to get 1 tablespoon of purple dye. That is a lot of snails. Someone would collect them by hand. They would then crush them, salt them over 3 days, and then they would boil them for 10 days more. Only then would they release that rich purple color. And you can see there's variation in the shade of purple as well. And the thing that might gross you out the most is that when you think about dyeing fabric, right? You've probably dyed Easter eggs before. What do you use to make it color fast so that the dye stays? Well, with Easter eggs, we use vinegar, okay? In this case, for this fabric in the first century, they used urine. That's what they had. Works pretty well. And you might imagine the smell of the vats. And imagining that smell, you would understand that it was usually kept outside the city walls. We're going to keep that over there where the wind doesn't pick up that smell. The hilarious part, though, and this totally reminds me of Hunger Games, the fabric. I mean, it's got crushed, salted, boiled snail juice mixed with urine. You guys, the fabric stunk. How would you like to be walking around in your lovely purple vestments and dresses and attire, but you're walking around smelly? It was smelly purple fabric. But it was a fashion statement. I mean, it's total Hunger Games. I love it. That's the picture I get in my mind. But you can see how extravagant this process is to produce this dye, let alone dye the fabric, let alone make the garments. This took a lot of people. And typically, we had kings and the uber wealthy wore purple, and that was it. And when Jesus starts this story, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple. They had an image and a smell in their mind of what that would be like. Just for them, just unattainable wealth. Like, we don't live like Jeff Bezos, right? It's hard for us to imagine ourselves in that position where you live in luxury every day. I mean, you think about the food he may have eaten. Likely, if he lived in that kind of luxury, every day would have been like Christmas, like a feast, lots and lots of food. And we don't necessarily live like that. It's hard for us to put ourselves in his position, right? You think about how a parable works. We should be able to put ourselves in one of the characters' positions, right? Have some empathy there, or maybe we identify with it. It's hard to identify with this guy. Not only does he live the life of luxury, but clearly his house was very opulent too. He had a gate. Now, this gate serves a physical function in real life, just like any gate would. There were gates to cities, right? Kings would come down to the gate to make decisions and offer judgments. So we know about gates, right? But it also has a literary function in this story. We're going to come back to the gate. It's going to come back. So hold on. Put that in your hip pocket. So this gate is actually from the model. It's in Jerusalem, but it's a miniature model of Jerusalem in the first century. And this is zoomed in on King Herod's palace in Jerusalem. And you can see there is a gate in the wall for people to come in or to keep people out. This man lived like King Herod. He had all of the wealth and luxury of a king. And at his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The word laid, where Lazarus was laid, really means placed. And it's the same word that's used in the story where the friends bring their paralyzed friend on a mat and they lift him up to the rooftop and lower him down so Jesus can heal him. That's the kind of placed that we're thinking about. Lazarus's friends likely carried him there, set him down, placed him on his own mat there likely, and with the hopes that the rich man would give alms, that he would share the food from his table, and that he would help take care of Lazarus. Now, his friends had very high hopes because, of course, we know that doesn't happen. And I think this artist helps us to visualize what's happening with poor Lazarus here at the rich man's gate. This painting actually is a vertical a portrait painting, and this is only the bottom half. The top half shows very high up and far away is the rich man's table with lots of people around it and lots of food. But it's too far away for Lazarus. He can't even get up to attain it or even to beg. Now, the NIV translates Lazarus' situation as he is a beggar, but the Greek really doesn't mean actively begging. He's not up and asking for help. He is just placed there. And we know he's thinking about the food, but he's not actively asking about it. And what's interesting is Lazarus is the Greek form of the name Eleazar. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, what other stories do you know that have an Abraham and an Eleazar? Genesis 16, of one of many, the real-life Abraham had a servant named Eleazar from Damascus. I don't think there's any tie-in, but it's just interesting. I'm sure a lot of these names were very common. But Eleazar means God has helped me. And it's pretty clear in this parable that Jesus is telling, the rich man's not helping Lazarus. And so God is the only one who can help him. And in verse 22, the time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. So another way we know that this is a parable is because what the verse just described is Jesus playing off of Jewish folklore about the end of the age, about the end times. And a lot of Jewish artists depicted the righteous being carried off into paradise by angels, whereas the evildoers were dragged down to the underworld by demons. And so Jesus is playing off of this Jewish folklore in this parable. And Jesus' first century audience would have been familiar. Well, they would have immediately recognized this literary motif that is like the genre of stories of people going into the realm of the dead or the underworld. And in fact, Hades, Greek mythology, is mentioned here. But it's this whole reversal of fortunes of the rich and poor. And that was a very common type of story all throughout ancient literature, not just in the Bible. So again, Jesus is playing off of their knowledge of these types of reversal stories. And there is a similar rabbinic parable about a rich sinner who actually got to go to paradise because he did one good deed. But we see here in this parable, this rich man has not done any good deeds. He did not help Lazarus at all. And so his punishment likely is because he allowed Lazarus to starve. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." And some hyperbole there, I think. But Abraham replied, "Son or child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony." So you'll notice the rich man refers to Abraham as father. And it's like he has a false sense of election. Now, what I mean is, if you think about why does Luke chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 1, Why did they have the genealogy of Jesus? Well, it goes all the way back up to Abraham. And Jews knew or expected that if they could show their lineage back up to Abraham, they would be saved because they were children of Abraham. But here, in this parable, well, we have a child of Abraham who is not saved. He is lost. And Abraham explains why. Abraham continues, "And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." Okay, wait a minute. So if nobody can come back from Hades, how did we get this information? I just want to reemphasize, this is not literal. It's a literary motif. Now, you remember that gate I told you to keep in your hip pocket? Okay, so it mirrors this chasm that is between the rich man in torment and Abraham and Lazarus in paradise. They have the same function, keeping certain people out and other people in. He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Okay, when I hear Abraham speaking those words, I hear him in a very calm voice, almost using the love and logic method. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but teachers have a specific love and logic teaching method. And there's a parenting love and logic method as well, where basically you let natural consequences be the teacher. And this is how I hear Abraham saying it. Well, I mean, you've got these. You've got everything you need. Right? Because the law and the prophets basically was the entire Hebrew Bible summed together. And when you hear the law and prophets, that should make you think back to the Shema. Do you remember we talked about the Shema many parables ago now, but for the Good Samaritan, right? So when the teacher of the law was asking, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And then he says, "Well, who's my neighbor?" And Jesus flips the question and basically emphasizes, the Shema is love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second command is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so those together, the law and the prophets, contain everything that you need to live a life of righteousness, of godliness. And it's already there. And so Jesus is emphasizing in this parable that they have everything they need to follow God. But you know who else tried to convince people about Jesus using the law and the prophets? If you look at Acts chapter 28, verses 23 to 24, you'll see the Apostle Paul used the law and the prophets when teaching to Jews in the synagogue to convince them about Jesus. But did everybody believe Paul when he used the law and the prophets? Even then they didn't believe. And by that point in history, Jesus had already died, been buried, and resurrected. and came back and appeared to 500 people. Just like what Abraham said, even if somebody from the dead comes back, not everybody will be convinced, including the rich man's brothers. So the question for us is, like those brothers, what will we do? And at this point, the parable is left open-ended. We don't know what's going to happen to those brothers. Are they going to listen to the law and the prophets? Are they going to follow what God has already given them? We don't know. And so that begs the question for the listeners: who had the law and the prophets? Are they going to follow the law and prophets? And for us today, we have the law and the prophets. Jesus fulfilled it and continued it. Are we going to hear and obey, like the Shema says? What this parable is really getting at is the use of wealth, but related to poverty. Now, Klein Snodgrass points out that poverty is not a gift from God, but it's a problem, one that is the result of sin by numerous people, and it needs relieving. And what the parable is really attacking is the type of wealth that is indifferent to poverty. The wealth that clouds your view or your ability to see the needs of those around you. This parable attacks the idea that our possessions and wealth are only for us to spend on ourselves. If we think about why Abraham is in this parable, what was he known for? If you go back to Genesis 18 specifically, how did he treat those 3 visitors? Did he close up his tent and pretend they weren't home? He was generous. He said, "Sarah, quick, go get 3 seahs of flour and basically make bread for an army." He was known for his great generosity. And that is such a contrast to the rich man. Abraham used his wealth to help others. The parable doesn't tell us how we're supposed to use our wealth to help the poor, but it's showing us that the wealthy and the poor are brothers. And any gospel that is not good news to the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. We see that in Luke 4. So, to Klein Snodgrass, the issue here is the willingness and ability to see a person in need and respond. The ability to see is the mark of Christian discipleship, and we have got to open our eyes and see the Lazarus at our gate. So you may be a member of a congregation that already has ministries in place to help the poor in your area. At my congregation, we have multiple ministries that go into the community to reach those in need. And I'll link to some below if you're in the Wichita, Kansas area. But if you're not, I encourage you, find out what other church ministries or other nonprofits already exist in your area that you can go volunteer with. It could also just be getting to know your own neighbors in your neighborhood. I'm ashamed to say that we lived in our house for 7 or 8 years before we really got to know our neighbors. We came and went every day and didn't really take the time to get to know people. Once we did, we realized we have some great neighbors, and we all text each other and look out for each other's houses and dogs and all of that. But before that, we didn't really venture out. And that's on me. So maybe you need to get to know your neighbors as well. We just had some new neighbors move in across the street. And my son and I decided that, you know what? We can make them some chocolate chip cookies. And so we did. And we haven't delivered them yet. They just got moved in. We're going to give them a day. And then we'll head over there with some deliciousness on a plate and welcome them to the neighborhood. But even more than just your neighborhood and your church congregation or local nonprofits, I want you to think about something that maybe is a little more invisible to you. Because again, the point of the parable is basically indifference to poverty. And how can we see the needs around us? When it comes to the products that we buy, or the food that we purchase at the grocery store, the clothing that we purchase, even the coffee beans that you use to make your morning coffee. Think about, if you didn't make it, it had to come from somewhere. Who made it? Where did it come from? And I want you to think about sometimes our invisible supply chain, because oftentimes when we have a consumer-driven society, we want cheap food and cheap clothes and cheap products, but that comes at a cost in this supply chain. Where is your clothing made? Is it made in Bangladesh? Because they have child labor in sweatshops in some places there. Is that where your clothing is made? How are they treating the women and or children who are making the clothing? There is documented sweatshop labor. And I feel like if we're not making our own clothing, we're buying it from someone. Who is making it, and are they being cared for? What about your morning coffee? Now think about where coffee beans come from. It could be Kenya. Lots of different places around the world produce coffee beans. But in Brazil, there is documented forced child labor to make to harvest the coffee beans. So just paying attention to, what are you buying? Where is it coming from? Who's harvesting it or making it? Now I know there's the fair trade label and many other certifications like that. That's a great thing to look at, absolutely, because they review these companies. Where do your strawberries come from? Have you ever thought about where they were grown and who grew them? In America, most of our strawberries are grown in California or Mexico. I mean, unless you go to a farmer's market, that's not what I'm talking about. If you buy food from a grocery store, it's likely coming on a truck shipped from California or Mexico. How are the migrant farm workers being treated? If frontline documentaries are true, they're not all being treated well. And it's a dangerous place for female farm workers especially. What about hair extensions? Did you know that poor women in China are growing and cutting their hair so they can feed their families? And what about chocolate? We all love chocolate, right? But what about the farmers in Ghana who harvest the cacao beans, who've never actually tasted a chocolate bar before because they can't afford it? Links to all of these examples will be below so you can read about what's happening in the world yourself. I'm asking you to see the poor, because typically they are the ones oppressed to make these types of products or to harvest our food, and we're not aware of that. And so if we are to see the Lazarus at our gate, it could literally be on our street or in our city. But it is also relevant to think about who is making the products you buy, the food you eat, and harvesting the coffee that you drink. we need to see them too. I want to close by reading a short takeaway from A.J. Levine's book that's, of course, linked in the description below. She re-emphasizes that the concern for almsgiving, so giving to the poor, was part of Jewish culture. So was love of neighbor. So the problem is not the message of the law and the prophets. The problem is that people don't listen. And clearly, like this rich man, did not take action. The parable ends on a cautionary note. Heed the command to aid the poor and the sick and the hungry, or you will eventually suffer worse poverty, greater pains, deeper hunger. Do not just contribute to the food drive, but invite the hungry into your home. Do not just put money in the collection plate, but use your resources to provide jobs and support for those in need. Do not treat the sick as burdens, but as beloved family members who deserve love and care. Know the names of the destitute. Each has a story to tell. Recognize, as Jesus puts it, that you cannot serve both God and Mammon. And she ends by saying, the point is that we uphold our part of the covenant by behaving as human beings should behave. We care for the poor. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. I hope this lesson will help you to see the Lazarus at your gate this week. Join me in the next video where we'll talk about the parable of the widow and the judge in Luke 18. I'll see you then.